Hello, my name is Dr. Matt Kearney. CVDACTION is a smart data tool that takes routinely recorded GP data to identify our patients who are at high risk of CVD, but whose care needs optimizing. It helps us to prioritize, so deciding what's important, where should we start, and it divides the work into manageable chunks so that we can match work to our capacity, which of course is of critical importance. So this is the homepage for CVDACTION. These are the 6 high-risk conditions: blood pressure, cholesterol, atrial fibrillation, diabetes, prediabetes, and chronic kidney disease. These are all conditions that cause cardiovascular disease, but where treatment has a big impact in preventing heart attacks and strokes. But the homepage gives us an overview of the sort of numbers involved, so we can think about where to begin to target. So for hypertension, for example, there are 1,034 patients included there, which itself is still a large number. And this is in a practice of, say, 15,000 patients. It's all dummy data, of course. But within that hypertension group, you can see that we've stratified into, there are 340 patients whose blood pressure is suboptimally managed, 77 patients with hypertension whose CKD is suboptimally managed, 470 patients who need broader cholesterol management for their cardiovascular risk, for example. In chronic kidney disease, there are 300 patients overall. For 181, it's the proteinuria management that is suboptimal. There are 15 who appear to have accelerated progression, and 175 who need broader cardiovascular risk management improving. And you can see the same sort of approach with the other conditions. So the question, of course, is where should we start and what will have the biggest impact for our patients? And in deciding that, it's really helpful to consider that across all of these conditions, the things that make a difference in all of the conditions is blood pressure optimization, lipid optimization, renal angiotensin blockade, and use of SGLT2 inhibitors in CKD and diabetes, as well as hemoglobin A1C management in diabetes and prediabetes, and anticoagulation and atrial fibrillation. But those first groups are common across all of the conditions. So clicking across the top, I'm going to look at cholesterol first of all to illustrate how this might work. So you see with all of the conditions, there are 3 or 4 panels. We're stratified into different groups to help with that workflow. You see there are a lot of patients whose primary prevention needs optimizing, so that's probably not where we'd start. Secondary prevention, there's 261 patients who already have cardiovascular disease, but whose lipid management is suboptimal. And within that, there are 78 patients with CVD who are not on any lipid-lowering therapy. And if I click on that bar and then show patients down the bottom, this will list my 78 patients. Sorry, let me just go back to that. So this will list my 78 patients. They've got CVD, they're not on any lipid-lowering therapy at all. If we get our team to bring those patients in and get them all onto statins, we could expect to prevent about 80 heart attacks and strokes just in this one practice in 3 years. So huge potential impact. Also within this group, there are patients who've got CVD. They're on a statin, but not maximal dose or intensity, so their risk could be reduced by optimizing further. There are 69 patients with CVD who are maximal statin therapy, but not treated to the target. The non-HDL-C is above target. So those 70 patients would be eligible for drugs like inclisiran, for example, or other PCSK9 inhibitors. So that's cholesterol. If we look at hypertension, similar sort of approach, 4 panels here. The first one, blood pressure not treated to target. 340 patients is a lot of patients. Where do you start? considering none of us have any spare capacity. Well, actually within that there were 10 patients with hypertension whose blood pressure is above 180 over 120, so very high risk. There's 36 whose blood pressure is above between 160 and 180, so that would be a good place to start. 46 patients, manageable number to bring in and get the blood pressure optimized. We know we'll have a quick and early impact on their cardiovascular risk. If we look at the second panel, this is patients who have hypertension but also have CVD. So 48 patients, hypertension, CVD, but not on any lipid-lowering therapy. Again, in this group, we prevent around 5 heart attacks and strokes in 5 years if we get them onto statins. But again, that's that further stratification to help with the numbers. So 44 patients there who would be eligible for the second-line therapies like inclisiran. Larger numbers where it's an issue of primary prevention with high Q-risk score or an unmeasured Q-risk score, for example. You'll notice also that for hypertension, also for AF and diabetes and pre-diabetes, there's a case finder button. So again, that might be a place we want some of our staff to start on. So in this case, it's patients who are not on the hypertension register, but whose blood pressure more than 3 months ago was above 140, so they may well have undiagnosed hypertension. So if we then look at the chronic kidney disease panel, again, the dashboard, there are 4 panels here. The first one is all about patients who've not had any EGFR measured in the appropriate time frame, whether that's a year or 6 months or 4 months, depending on severity. If we look at the proteinuria management, so there's 181 patients, it's a large number. 110 of those have not had an ACR measured in the last 12 months. So that's a priority group for our healthcare assistants, for example, or other staff to bring in and get their urine tested. We know that if we want to prevent heart attacks and strokes in people with CKD, the things that matter are using renal angiotensin antagonists when they're appropriate, using SGLT2 inhibitors when they're appropriate, as well as managing blood pressure optimally and managing lipid lowering appropriately as well. And you can see we've got really relatively small numbers of patients here with CKD whose ACR is above target levels, who are not on appropriate renal angiotensin antagonists. Patients with CKD and hypertension, there are 9 of those who are not on renal angiotensin antagonists. 23 patients with CKD and diabetes, ACR above threshold, who are not on the appropriate therapies. So you can see relatively smaller numbers of patients to help us manage our workflow, but we know these are high impact interventions. The broader cardiovascular risk management, again, even in patients with CKD, the key things that matter are blood pressure and cholesterol, as well as the use of those other drugs. And again, it's finding there's relatively small numbers of patients who are not on lipid-lowering therapy or whose blood pressure is not treated to target, for example. And we can see the same if we look at diabetes, the same sort of approach. We could choose to start here, for example. So in diabetes, the first panel is about patients treated to target, whether that's their HbA1c or their blood pressure, and you can see relatively small numbers of patients here where we know that the intervention will have a high impact. There's the broader cardiovascular risk management, so lipid-lowering therapy, 13 patients with diabetes and CVD, not on statins. Small number, but very high risk and high impact for that intervention. There's 123 patients with type 2 diabetes and CVD or heart failure, and they're not on SGLT2 inhibitors, for example. So all helps us to prioritize, to focus on the high impact interventions that will make a difference and create manageable chunks of patients. So for biggest impact, well, we could start with all of our patients with hypertension, all of our patients with CVD, or we could focus in on patients with CKD and diabetes, and within that, focus on treating to target, focus on lipid management and SGLT2 inhibitors, or focus on use of renal angiotensin antagonists. So we know that we can safely understand our group of patients and prioritize appropriately. Another thing that we can do to help us to prioritize, if we go back to the hypertension page, we can see we have the ability actually to focus on health inequalities also, because we know that CVD is a major driver of health inequalities. It accounts for about a fifth of the life expectancy gap between rich and poor. If we take these patients with hypertension whose blood pressure is above target, and if I click on all three, or say three of those top groups, so blood pressure above 140/90, and if I also click on show demographics, I can see that just in those cohorts, so blood pressure poorly controlled, actually I could find all my patients in the most deprived quintile. There's 110 of those. I could focus on ethnicity, so I've got 20 patients of Asian background, 28 patients whose blood pressure is poorly controlled, or I've got 11 patients with severe mental illness. And the thing about severe mental illness is the patients on average die 10 to 20 years earlier than the rest of the population, but they don't die of a severe mental illness, they die of heart attacks and strokes. And if I also click on show patients, then it lists my 11 patients. So again, it's something from the team to focus on, which we know will have a big impact on heart attacks and strokes, but an impact on health inequalities also. The final thing that I would like to mention, if we go to the CKD dashboard and then look at the help panel, there are various links and useful resources that you can find in the help panel. But if I just focus on the first of those, for every condition, there is a one-pager, or one slide that tells me or my pharmacists or nurses, these are the key things we need to be doing once we've looked at the numbers. It's a simple digest of nice guidance. So the case finder that we need to focus in on finding patients who may not be coded. There's the monitoring, making sure our patients have the EGFR and ACR tested appropriately. And then there's the management of proteinuria, the use of renal angiotensin blockade or SGLT2 inhibitors where appropriate. And then blood pressure treated to target, lipid management in patients with or without CVD. And of course, for all of these patients, all of these conditions, there is support for education, self-management and behaviour change, which you know is critical. So I hope that you found this useful to help understand how we can use CVDACTION to enable this prioritisation and focus. But it is all about focus. It's the high impact interventions that will make a difference to our patients and difference to our population health. It helps us to prioritise, create manageable chunks of work that match our capacity and fit in to our workflow. So I hope you find that helpful. Thank you very much.